My father and my father's father had both worked in the Copperfield mine. It was strange, though, as the mine was abundant with coal, not copper. It ran deep into the core of the mountain, and its black gold helped feed the bellies of many families. My grandfather and my father had both died inside those winding tunnels, and the women in my family forbade any male to seek employment there. The mine was picked clean and closed in 1945. The great entrance was boarded and left to be forgotten. It was, for the most part, but those who had lived during the operation of the mine still whisper under covered hands about the strange happenings. I know only what my grandmother has told me, told to her by my grandfather. I've only just remembered it, sought to write it down for safekeeping. You see, strange appearances and sounds have been keeping me up at night. These phantoms are what have brought me back to the stories I was told as a child. One night, when my father was still a baby, my grandfather had come home from work deeply pale underneath the black coal suit that covered his face. He had stumbled into the small house, collapsed into his favorite chair by the fire. My grandmother was startled by this and accidentally slipped the nipple off the bottle out of my father's lips, causing him to cry. After settling down the baby, my grandmother took my grandfather's dinner to him and sat beside him in her rocking chair.
We never should have dug deeper,
my grandfather whispered, not touching his food. His eyes were bloodshot and the brown of his eyes seemed black in the firelight.
Did a tunnel collapse?
My grandmother inquired, the unfinished quilt resting on her lap, completely forgotten. My grandfather shook his head and closed his eyes. He wiped his face with a suit-covered hand. The black smudges on his face now turned to streaks that followed his fingertips down to his neck.
Martha, we found something that no man should have ever found. Should have been left alone, buried under that mountain.
His voice shook as he spoke. He leaned back into his chair and his eyes took on a faraway look.
George Henley is dead, and I'm sure others are going to die too.
The room was quiet, the only sound being that of the fire crackling and snapping in the hearth. My grandmother wasn't sure what to say, sat silent, waiting for my grandfather to continue.
We were in the southern shaft tonight, the deepest part of the whole system. It was behind a big stone slab. We should have known something bad was behind it, the stone not appearing natural at all. It was placed there. The foreman ordered us to blast it. So George, Bill, and I set up a stick of dynamite and ran a wire. Once the tunnel was clear, we blew it.
My grandfather made a loud explosion sound, sat up in his chair, and my father started to cry in his crib. But my grandmother was too startled to go to him.
After the dust settled, and we were sure the mountain wasn't going to cave in over our heads, we inspected the hole.
He shivered violently and finally looked at my grandmother. The fear and shock in his face scared my grandmother so bad, she told me she almost picked up my father and ran from the house.
There was a cavern on the other side. One that was so large we couldn't see all the way across or see the top.
As he said this, his eyes became unfocused and he looked towards the ceiling, like he was seeing something that only he could see.
There was a lake under the mountain. So big, Martha, it had waves.
He stopped and took a moment to gather his courage and continue.
The water was pitch black, seemed like liquid obsidian. The guys and I, we didn't want to go in, but the foreman made us. He made us go in. The coward didn't go with us, just stayed back in the tunnel watching.
Grandfather stood here and walked over to the crib where my now sleeping father lay. My father had cried himself to sleep. My grandfather stood for a long time, looking down at him.
Isaac, please. I don't want to hear any more. You're frightening me.
My grandmother whimpered, going to her husband's side, placing a hand on his shoulder. He laughed loudly, almost maniacally.
You're scared, Martha? You should have seen it. You should have seen what happened to George when we got near that damn water.
He turned to her and gripped her shoulders tightly.
There were people, or things, in the water. We couldn't see them until we got closer. There were thousands of people at the bottom of the lake, reaching up towards the surface. One of them grabbed George by the ankle, dragged him under. Bill and I tried to pull him back, but it was like a million hands were pulling him away from us.
His voice was shaking, and tears started to stream down his black-stained cheeks.
But the worst thing, Martha, the worst thing was that not only was George screaming, but the people under the water were too. They were screaming for help. They were so loud.
He sobbed and collapsed into my grandmother's arms. My grandmother held him, rocked him gently, stroking his dark hair to calm him. After hours, when the sun finally came up, he looked up and said,
There was a boat. What do you call it? A gondola. There was a tall man on it, pushing towards us. Bill and I, we ran when we saw him. We weren't worried about George anymore. We were worried about what that thing would do if it reached the shore, if it reached us.
He took in a deep, shuddering breath.
We sealed the opening with as many boxes and things as we could, but I think if it wants to get out, it will. It probably has.
That's where my grandfather's story ends. Later that day, he went back. My grandmother had begged him not to, but he was determined to keep that thing trapped. He marched up to the mine with tools and planks of thick wood, the only thing he could find. But he never came back. My grandmother was told that a tunnel collapsed on him, but she doesn't believe it. They never brought her his corpse, and they buried an empty coffin. Before my grandmother passed, she called me to her bedside, held my hand in a vice-like grip. She said,
Don't go to that mountain. I begged your father not to, but he had no choice. Please, Sean, don't go anywhere near it. It holds the lake of the damned. It'll drag you to hell, all like the rest.
When people come across something unexplainable, they try to find rational reasoning behind it. I mean, it's only natural, right? Well, sometimes things are better left unexplained. I learned this the hard way. It was a cool Thursday afternoon. I had just got off work and wanted to take a stroll to clear my head. I find it therapeutic. Temperatures weren't too cold, but it was cool enough that you'd want to wear a thin jacket. Typical fall weather. As I walked, I felt the wind breeze through my hair as it whistled in my ear. I usually only walk through my small neighborhood on the sidewalk, but saw a rather large wooded area. I decided to walk into it, thinking that a change of scenery would be nice. As I wandered into the woods, I heard the crunching of leaves beneath my feet. The farther I walked into the woods, the more trees I began seeing around me. I told myself that it'd probably be best if I didn't stroll too far, so I wouldn't have a hard time finding my way back. As I continued walking at a steady pace, I noticed a small dirt trail. Not thinking too much about it, I followed it. It led me to a cove of some sort, with enough trees surrounding that it formed a pretty big circle. The dirt trail ended. There was no path ahead, just a circle with surrounding trees. The ground was covered with a ton of leaves, but one thing in particular caught my attention. A door, A door in the middle of this forest cove. It was possibly the strangest thing I had ever seen. My curiosity caused me to walk up to it. It was no bigger than your average house door. It had a dark brown color to it, and it was very clearly made out of wood. The door was old, but still sturdy and strong. I put my hand on the door and felt its rough wooded exterior. It had a door frame around it, so that if you could open it like any other door would. I looked down at the doorknob. To no surprise, the doorknob was just as old and ruined as the rest of the door, but still sturdy. I reached down and grabbed the knob. It was black and metal. The knob was cold due to the cool fall air. I tried turning the knob, but to no avail. It felt like the door was locked. I tried twisting and turning a few more times, but again the door did not open. I walked to the other side of the door and tried the knob one more time. I was met with the same results. Something inside of me wanted to open this door, no matter what. I tried kicking the door, and it was surprisingly way sturdier than I thought. It felt as if it was bolted to the ground. I looked down at the ground around the door. After kicking the leaves away, I came to a discovery. The door frame went inside of the ground. The door must have been here for quite a while because the ground around it showed no signs of any digging or tampering. I messed with the door for a long period of time, trying different ways to get it open. All of my attempts ended in failure. After failing, I realized that it was getting quite late and decided to head home. At my house, I made a small dinner and turned on the TV. After flipping through multiple channels, one channel caught my eye. The news channel. Hey, why not? I thought. I kept it on the news channel and started eating. They had been reporting of a murder that happened recently. Apparently, the victim was a 24-year-old man, blonde hair, and was in a wheelchair. He had been shot in the head by some people that were robbing a store nearby. Gruesome stuff, I said to myself. I finished up my dinner, brushed my teeth, and went to bed. The next day was like any other weekday. I went to work at a small-town retail store. It wasn't your ideal job, but it worked. It put food on the table and paid the bills. That's all I really needed. After working a long and tiresome shift, I clocked out and went on another walk. I found myself walking towards that same forest I went to yesterday. But somehow, I didn't realize it. Eventually, I ended up at the entrance to the woods. I took a deep breath and entered. Seeking out the dirt trail was quite a challenge, since I didn't remember exactly where it was. After a short time period, I finally found it. I followed the trail and reached the strange cove. What I saw before me was the worn-out wooden door. I ran up to it and immediately tried the doorknob. It was still locked. I was frustrated because I really wanted this door to open. It was almost a need to me. I began pacing back and forth in front of the door, thinking of the many ways I could try to get it open. As I continued the pacing, I noticed the slight elevation on the ground in front of the door. I looked down and kicked the leaves out of the way. What was revealed was a very dirtied welcome mat. I hadn't noticed it before. What was read on the mat was, "Lift me." I picked up the mat. Under it was several dead bugs. I instantly threw the mat and took a big step back. What the hell? I looked down and saw a key in the middle of all the disgusting dead creatures. It was broken into 2 pieces. I picked them up and inspected them. The pieces were rusted. There was no way I could glue the 2 together. I took the end of the key and put it into the lock of the door, but it wasn't long enough. I had to have the whole key. I looked up and saw the sun setting and the sky getting dark. I stuffed the broken key into my pocket and turned back to head home. Today was Saturday. I had weekends off, so I had the whole day free. I made up my mind to find a way to get this key fixed somehow. There was an old antique shop in town, and they would fix old things that were broken if you brought it in. I decided to try my luck with that. I parked right in front of the shop. It was a small store that was right in between two other stores. I exited my vehicle and went into the shop. I looked around and saw a variety of items around me. Everything ranging from house decor, musical instruments, paintings, and mirrors. I looked forward to find an old man sitting at the counter. He seemed really old and had that grumpy look. He had a messy white beard, and the few hairs he had on his head were white as well. He was reading the newspaper, so he really didn't see me at first.
Excuse me, sir.
I waved at him. He looked up at me. I looked into his eyes. His left eye was cloudy, and his right was a light blue color.
I was wondering if you could get this fixed for me.
For some odd reason, I was intimidated by the old man. I showed him the broken key.
You want me to fix a key for you?
His voice was deep and raspy. His teeth were yellow and rotten. Some were even missing.
Yes, please,
I answered. He held his hand out. His hand was withered, very wrinkly, almost like a skeleton's hand. I dropped the key pieces into his hand.
It'll be a while,
he spoke.
No problem.
The old man grabbed his cane, slowly walked to the door that led to the back of the building. I waited around the store for what seemed like a half an hour. The old man came out, and I walked up to him. He reached out with a key in his hand. I took it. The key was whole again, and though it still felt a bit rough, it seemed like it would work. I paid him for his work.
May I ask, what are you doing with an old broken key like that?
I looked at him.
Just found this old house and hoped this key would work. I'm curious to see what's inside.
I answered him. The old man smirked and said,
Curiosity killed the cat.
I thanked him and sprinted out of the store into my car. I got in and drove to the forest. I arrived back at the spot where the door was. I walked up to it and faced it. I tried the doorknob, just to see if anyone else may have gotten it open. My curiosity was soon answered with a locked door. Figures, I said to myself. I looked down at the lock and took the key out of my pocket. I slowly inserted the key into the lock and turned. The lock slot turned with the key. I put my hand on the doorknob, twisted it. This time it twisted all the way. I then pushed the door forward. I could hear a creaking noise as it slowly opened. What I saw was just the other side of the door. Nothing special happened. I stepped through the door frame and closed the door behind me. I looked around. The air began getting colder. The wind was whistling louder. Fog began appearing around me. What was happening? I didn't understand. Then I saw something, or someone rather. What crept out of the fog was a man in a wheelchair.
Excuse me, who are you? What's going on?
I asked. I was met with silence as the man came closer and closer to me. The closer he got, the better I could see him. He had blonde hair. His face was covered in red. There was a hole in the middle of his head. It occurred to me that what I had been looking at was a dead man. The same man I saw on the news the other day.
Let us out! Let us out!
He choked out. Frozen in fear, all I could do was stand still as he came even closer. I slowly started walking backwards towards the door. I tripped over something as I was walking back. I fell to the ground, and I soon saw what was beneath me. It was a dead body, a mangled corpse. You could only tell it was a body because the head was still intact. The head turned slowly towards mine.
You could free us.
The head spoke. At this point, I got up on my feet as quickly as I could and ran towards the door. It seemed as if the door had gotten farther from me than it was before. I sprinted while screaming.
Help! Someone help!
I yelled out. The fog had cleared up a bit. As I ran, I looked around and saw more dead people. Some were hanging from nooses in the trees, some were on the ground, bloodied. Some were even walking towards me. Well, the ones who still had legs to walk with. But there's one thing they all had in common. They seemed to be speaking. I couldn't hear what the ones farthest from me were saying, but the ones closer were whispering something along the lines of,
"Let me out! You can't leave! Stay with us!"
The ones who weren't saying anything were crying and screaming. All I could hear around me were those whispers and screams. I reached the door and fumbled the key out of my pocket. The dead people were getting closer to me. I was shaking so much that I had dropped the key into the leaves on the ground. I reached down and rapidly brushed away the leaves so I could get the key. I grabbed the key and inserted it into the lock. I quickly twisted and pushed the door open. I ran through the door and slammed it shut behind me, breathing very heavily. I noticed the air become warmer, and the fog vanished completely. I ran away from the door and started yelling.
Help! Somebody! Help, please!
All I did was yell. As I ran farther from the forest cove, I ran into a police officer with a flashlight in hand. There was so much going on that I didn't notice how dark it had gotten.
Whoa, calm down, what's wrong?
The concerned officer asked me. I was panting. Please, you have to come with me. There's dead people. I yelled frantically.
Listen, calm down. I'm here because we've been getting calls about screaming going on in the forest. Was that all you?
No, not just me. There's people that need help. You have to help them.
I pleaded desperately.
All right, bring me to them. I'll get them help right away.
I led the officer back to the cove, but what I stumbled upon shocked me. The door wasn't there. It had completely vanished.
What am I looking for?
The officer asked me.
Wait, it's not here. Why? It was just here!
I yelled.
What was?
The officer looked at me very confused. I looked down and sighed.
Nothing. It must have been my imagination.
I was defeated.
You sure you're all right?
The officer asked me while pointing to his head.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm not crazy.
Well, I'm gonna stick around and look for a bit, just to make sure. You head on home, all right? Get some sleep.
Yeah, I'll do that. I walked out of the cove and made my way out of the forest. Every day since then, all I could think about was that incident. What was that? Was it just a dream? I knew none of my questions would ever be answered. No one would ever believe me either. If I tried telling anybody, they'd definitely think I was crazy. The door may have disappeared, but the key remained. Why? Don't ask me. I don't have a clue. I can't bring myself to get rid of it either. I always keep it on me. Maybe I'll stumble upon that door again, and curiosity will kill me one more time.
The waves tower above the ship, seeming to block out the sky entirely. They are dark, menacing, and icy cold. Flashes of lightning race through the sky, highlight the dark shapes under the waves. Formless black shadows circle the ship and ride the colossal waves into the sky. The SS Marianna had never seen a storm this destructive, and certainly had never seen the likes of the creatures below. Wally had signed on to the voyage in an attempt to escape the mistakes of his life. Loan collectors had seized everything, and his wife had left him in the gutter. The sea seemed to be the only option. A wide, vast world that would forgive him for a life of deceit and foolishness. But now, as he clung to the center mast, his hair flying wildly around his face, he wished more than anything to be back home. The rain pounded on the deck. The members of the crew flew around the ship in attempts to keep it afloat. The ship teetered left and right so violently, Wally feared they would flip. Some of the men had fallen overboard and were swallowed by the unforgiving sea. He could hear the captain shouting orders from somewhere above, but Wally himself was too scared to move. His fingers bleeding from burying his nails into the wood. His knuckles are white and strained. You can feel his heart pounding along with the thunder. His eyes are wide and stung with sea spray. You can see other men falling over, being sucked into the blackened mass below. Some screamed for his help, but their cries only caused him to grip the mast tighter. There are things below the surface of the water, things swarming the drowning men. The dark masses range from size, but all of them are shaped like nothing Wally has ever seen before. They don't move like sharks or killer whales. They seem to have long arms, slender tentacles, which they use to drag their victims further into the depths. Wally swore he could hear laughing, singing, sounds of something not of this world. Wally closed his eyes tightly, prayed for the first time in his life, as the ship flipped over.